Hello, this is Warren Pilkington, aka Was. My first memory of technology that I used as a child was when I went round to my uncle's house and he produced a big box. And that big box was the original packaging for the wood grain version of the Atari Video Computer System, aka VCS, aka 2600. Naturally, everyone had a copy of Combat, so we'd end up playing that for a couple of hours. We'd normally have the big plane versus the three small planes, the tanks with the bullets that would rotate around the screen and bombard everywhere. And it was just simple, addictive fun. Later on, he got some more games, and we enjoyed playing Space Invaders with the bendy bullets. That was a particularly fun level. And also Pac Man, which I ended up playing for about 5-6 hours at one birthday party one year and ended up completely clocking the score. But it was fond memories, and it's still a console that I enjoy playing to this day. I have the junior version now. I still have a load of games for it. And it was just the first introduction to gaming as well as technology. So it was something I really enjoyed.
Welcome to another episode of the Byte High No Limit podcast with me, Carlos. It is the podcast about people's relationship with technology. This episode, we are speaking to Randy Kindig, who has been hosting the Floppy Days podcast for many years now. And it was a great privilege to speak to Randy about how he got into podcasting and also how he started his vintage collection of computers. So without any further ado, let's pole straight into the interview, and I hope you enjoy it. So when all this started, then, I mean, how did it all come about? What was your first computer that you used?
Well, the first computer that I ever owned was a TRS-80 Model 1. So I was just graduating from college at Purdue University. You can see it on my shirt.
Yeah.
And I had been looking at them because Radio Shacks, were everywhere at that time. And I had been playing with a Model 1 in the store. I wanted one really badly because even though I was in the nuclear engineering program at Purdue, I really had a strong interest in computers and information technology. And she knew that I wanted one. And in 1979, I graduated from Purdue, and she got me the Model 1 as my graduation present.
Oh wow, that's quite impressive. So so you majored in what particular field? Nuclear engineering, did you say?
Yeah,
Wow.
nuclear engineering.
Wow. So we have a phrase where you say you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this, but it helps. I'm close to one with a nuclear engineer, but excellent. And did you sort of go on to apply that knowledge sort of like in your working life after college?
I did. I was in nuclear engineering. I started work with an electric utility, who was actually building a nuclear power plant in southern Indiana. And, while they gave me a particular task that I needed to do, as part of my job, I always tried to convince my boss that what I needed to do had to do with programming. So there was somebody there who was like programming nuclear engineering type programs in BASIC on our mainframe, and I helped him as much as I could. I started really after I got the TRS-80 Model 1. I really started getting interested in computers, and actually started then on a master's degree in computer science. At that time. So I was probably out of school a year maybe from my bachelor's when I started on my master's in computer science.
I've enjoyed listening back about the TRS-80, and how long did you manage to use that for before you went on to something else?
Yeah, so I used that, I'm trying to think exactly, because I believe it was in 1981. Probably. So I probably had the TRS-80 Model 1 2 to 3 years when I decided that as much as I love the Model 1, and I did, and I did a lot of things with it, I really wanted something that had color graphics. And that's when I started looking around to see, well, what's out there that has color graphics that's going to be relatively inexpensive. Because even though I was in the workforce, my wife and I were just starting out, and I couldn't afford to spend a lot of money on a computer. I couldn't buy an Apple. An Apple II is what I would really have loved to have had, but I just could not afford that. So I started looking around. So it was probably 2 to 3 years that I had the Model 1.
Yeah.
I remember, I still to this day remember, things were a lot different in those days when you wanted to sell a computer. I had to find a shop somewhere who wanted to buy it from me. And then I worked with them over the phone for a price. And I remember boxing it up and sending it to them. And then they sent me a check, and it was kind of bittersweet because I hated to give that machine up, but I was ready to move on as well.
Hmm. So the machines were more or less like part exchanged through dealers.
Yeah, I mean, when you wanted to sell one,
Mhm.
I mean, he was willing to buy it, just straight out. And I bought my next machine that I ended up buying was the Atari 800, after doing all my research and deciding that was the machine that I wanted. I bought that somewhere else.
And was that the 800 that had like a proper keyboard on it.
Yeah,
It wasn't a membrane keyboard. So I remember there was an Atari with a with
the
like a sort of
400.
the
Yeah,
400, yeah. So the
yeah.
800 and was that one, if memory serves, that had sort of like a silver function keys going down in a band on the right hand side, or was that the XL?
That's the
Um,
XL.
yeah,
The
yeah.
XL has the silver one. I mean, this has the function keys, but they're not.
Oh, right, yes.
It's a whole totally different style of case. They almost look like a typewriter,
Yeah.
and but they're solid. They're built like a tank. They actually have slots inside, so I saw cards were actually made for them. I love the 800. It's probably my favorite machine of all time is the Atari 800.
So what was the progression after the 800 then? Do you sort of like did they all just sort of go in a box and you start using sort of like a 16-bit or something like that, or a
Well,
PC?
yeah, I mean, really, yes to both. I had that machine for a couple of years and then it started giving me problems. So I actually got an 800 XL then at that point. And then I had it another couple years. And then in 1985, when the Atari ST came out, and I was pretty entrenched in Atari at that point, I went ahead and upgraded to the Atari ST, the 520 ST.
Mhm.
And so that was my next machine was the
Mm.
16-bit
Mm.
ST.
Yeah, there was quite a following for them here as well. The ST they're very very popular, and they're very good, very powerful on music applications as well. Electronic groups used the 520 ST for sure. So yeah, they're a powerful thing. I know that you're very interested in the 8 bits going right up to basically the advent of the 16 bits. But it just seems that when you stand back, there seems to be a very long lineage of 8-bit computers, a shorter lineage of 16-bit computers, and then it really, to me,
Yeah.
it comes to a complete end because like everybody's using a PC now, and there's nothing really unique about it. It's really down to what the user wants to do with the machine that sets the machines apart. They're all the same really underneath the bonnet.
Exactly. Well, and I think a lot of that has to do with, the IBM PC came out in 81, and I'm not even sure when the clone started appearing, but that whole platform kind of took off. The 16-bit platform didn't really come out until 84 with the Macintosh and then the ST and the Amiga. So by then, the IBM PC was pretty well entrenched, and the 16 bits just never got a chance
Mm,
to gain a foothold.
mm,
My next machine after the ST was a an IBM clone. It was probably in, let's see, I got my ST in 85. It was probably in 87, maybe, when I got my first IBM clone. And, to me, that was the end of the world right there, but I needed it because of work. I was using a PC at work, and if I had a PC clone, I could do work at home. You couldn't do that on the ST, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it was a sad time.
Yeah, it's ironic. I think the first thing I ever did when I was gifted my first PC, which was like a hand-me-down from a friend of mine, first thing I did was stick an emulator on it and then
Yeah.
started playing old games on it, and that's and I guess that's where sort of the retro gaming come back out. People discovered emulators and they could have every machine in a box again. But existentially, people then bought the machines back again and put value back in the market, I guess. With your TRS-80 and then your Atari 800, a few years later, you decide to make a podcast about them all. So what was the click moment? What was the moment that sort of like you said to yourself, I could make a podcast and I want to make a podcast about that subject. Was there a particular defining event?
There were a couple of things, actually. Um, I think probably what kicked it all off is that my wife and I bought land in Montana. I don't know if you're familiar with Montana in the United States, but it's a very large, very mountainous, very beautiful state. And we decided to buy some land out there. And it turns out that one of the key cities in Montana, by the name of Bozeman, has a vintage computer museum located there. And I discovered this in Bozeman. And I remember taking my daughter to that museum and walking through it. And they had a display. This was probably in, let's see, probably around 2000, maybe. And they had a display of some of the old home computers. And I was showing my daughter, I had one of those. I had one of those. I wanted one of those, and that kind of really kicked off my desire to find out more about the vintage computers. And a few years later, it got me interested enough that I started researching whether you could still buy these things. Could you even find them anymore? Some of these machines that I knew from back in the day, like the TI-99 or my old Atari or the TRS-80 Model 1. And I started listening to a podcast by the name of Retrobits with Earl Evans. I don't know. Now, Earl doesn't keep that up anymore, but you can still listen to the old shows. It was a great podcast. I loved that podcast. And I just loved Earl's voice. And I started listening to that, and that even got me more interested in these old computers. And so I started researching places like eBay, and I found out, yeah, you could buy these things, and they weren't that expensive. At least some of them weren't at that time. That's not so true today, but I think probably one of the first ones I bought off of eBay, it was one of the very low-end machines. I think it might have been a VIC-20, might have been the very first machine that I purchased. And it kind of took off from there. I started buying all sorts of different machines at that point. And then I found out that there were computer shows, actual vintage computer shows. In fact, there was one in Lafayette. Here, I'm 32 miles away from Lafayette. I didn't even know at that time that there were vintage computer shows there. And that got me interested in finding out about computer shows, started attending some computer shows. And then I decided, yeah, you know what? I love the podcast. I love Retrobits. Retrobits was winding down at that point. I love vintage computers. I'd like to give back to the community a little bit. I want to start a podcast. And that's what kind of kicked it off.
Yeah. So the podcast, I mean, we haven't mentioned yet, but it's been you're in your 11th year now
Yeah.
of Floppy Days. So
This month I hit 11 years. Yeah.
well, happy birthday to
Thank
Floppy Days,
you.
definitely.
I don't
And
remember what exact date was, but it was definitely in February.
sort of wondering, when you started the podcast, did you think it would actually go on 11 years, or were you going to say, "Oh, I'm going to just cover the computers that I own, and then we'll see how it goes," or was it always your plan to to go this long?
No, I never really thought about it. I mean, at the time, it's just something I wanted to do. And I knew there were a lot of computers that had been released in the, anywhere from 77 to 85 time frame. But at that time, I really didn't know that there were as many as there as there were, as I discovered later. So I really didn't go into it thinking, oh, I'm going to run, do this for 10 years or 20 years or
Hmm.
5 and then quit or whatever. It's just I started making a list. I found a timeline of when all of these computers were released. I decided I would just go, down that timeline and see how things went.
Hmm.
And before I knew it, there we are at 11 years.
Yeah, no, that's it. And I mean, at the moment, whereabouts are you're covering the Grundy Newbrain, which was
Yep.
a computer over here. So that puts us like 1983 or 1982, 83, was it? Or when
We're
that
actually
came?
1982, 1982.
1982. So it's taken 11 years to get to 1982. And I know that
Yes.
sometimes you have to jump forward and jump backwards, which is completely understandable. But it must be a bittersweet experience when somebody else rocks up and goes, "Oh, have you covered this particular computer and this particular variant?" And you're learning about new computers all the time.
That's
There must be a
right.
part of you that goes, "Yes," and there's another bit that goes, "Oh no."
Yeah, I think there's still enough computers left to cover if I could. So I'm planning on covering like through probably 1985, 1986. There's probably enough for another 10 years. I mean,
Mm,
God forbid that I live that long. Um, there's certainly enough material to last another 10 years. Between covering computers, and then, of course, the other part of the podcast is interviewing
mm,
people
mm.
who were involved in development of a lot of these computers. Between those two things, there's a lot of material.
Mm. Are there any particular computers that you're sort of like looking forward to covering in the future? You want you want the calendar to flick over quickly to focus on in particular.
Um, I'm certainly excited to finally, eventually, there's still a few years down the road to get to the ST computers, so I can
Mm.
talk about those since I've got that history.
Hmm.
I'm really enjoyed. And when I went into this, I didn't know anything about anything but U.S. computers.
Mm.
So I've really enjoyed being able to out about all the ones from the UK and Europe and Australia and other places. So
Mm.
that's been a lot of fun. Um, yeah, when I look at the list, it's like, wow, I still got a lot to cover. There are a couple I'm a little scared to cover. Things like this Commodore 64
Mm.
is, it came out in 1982. So that's one of them I need to be covering fairly soon.
Mm.
But the thing is, I'm afraid I can't do the machine justice. And I'm a little concerned about whether I can get enough of the right information that people want to know and care about. What level of knowledge do you assume when you're doing these things? I try to assume that people don't know anything about the particular machine. There are going to be people who aren't going to listen to the Commodore 64 series probably because they already know everything about the Commodore 64. And what I tell them isn't going to be something they're going to learn anything. But there will be people who, like me, who had the Atari 8-bit line and didn't have a Commodore back in the day and doesn't know a lot about it. The machine itself, what was unique about that machine? And why the people who love them, why do they love them? And,
Mm.
just what was different about that. Every one of these machines had its own personality. And it's really fascinating to understand what was different and to try to understand why the developers did that when they developed the machine. And I'm not one of those purists that has to have like the machine and all the original hardware around it. I like to have some of the original hardware, like the original floppy drives and those sort of things. Maybe one example of it, but I didn't enjoy using. Well, I remember when I first got my first floppy drive, I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, because it was so much better than cassette. But I don't really today enjoy using the old floppy drives, or obviously modems are totally out of date. You can't even use the modems anymore. I don't enjoy using the printers from back in the day, those sorts of things. So that's why I enjoy the modern upgrades on some of these machines so much.
Do you still get people who contact you and say, "Oh, what, have you heard of this computer, or what about this particular machine?"
Yeah, to answer your question, absolutely that happens. Once in a while, I'll run across a machine. Somebody will talk about a machine, or it'll get mentioned somewhere. It's like, what is that? I've never heard of that one. And I'll look on my timeline, because I've got my timeline laid out for as long as I'm going to run the show. And it's not on my timeline. It's like, okay, I guess I need to add another computer in my timeline.
Yeah. Also, I know that you have an interest in calculators and organizers and the like. So, do you have scope to cover more organizers or anything like that in the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, they have to be programmable type things. I'm not interested in non-programmable calculators or organizers in particular. It has to be something that has BASIC on it, something or at least programmable in some manner. So I do have I'll be covering some other calculators down the line, as well as I don't know yet if I'm going to cover them on Floppy Days, but if I do, it's going to be way down the line. And that would be like the PDAs, because those were programmable.
Yeah.
Depends on whether the show runs that long.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the Scion organizer too. I've got a pair of them, and that runs OPL, which is sort of like a programming language as well. They're completely bulletproof. I love them so much, but I turned one on the other day. It's got a 9-volt battery in it. I turned one on after a year, and it's still powered up. And it's just they're just great little computers.
Yeah, I mean, my TI 58 that I had in college before I had my Model 1, I programmed on it because it had, I'm trying to remember how many steps it had, 480 steps or 960 steps. Anyway, you could write a fairly lengthy program on it, and I used to program it quite a bit. And do I pull it out much today?
No, that's it. Yeah, that's it. So what's your process when you podcast?
Yeah, so I typically I start contacting potential co-hosts way ahead of time for the podcast when I'm going to talk about a particular computer. And my first focus is usually just to get those recorded, do all the research on the machine, and then do the actual episode with the co-host. And then when, I don't know, a couple of weeks before the end of the month, I'll start putting all the other stuff at the beginning of it, all the intro and latest acquisitions and upcoming shows and all that stuff. And then I'll publish it. So I try to do one show a month. And it's kind of nice right now because I'm actually got probably 6 shows ahead where I've already recorded either with a co-host or with an interviewee. And so for the next 6 months, I don't have to worry about at the last minute trying to scramble and find somebody to interview or to co-host or that sort of thing. So it's great to be ahead.
No, that's good. And do you take part in any other podcasts at all?
I do co-host the Antic podcast with Brad Arnold and Kay Savitz, and we are hitting 11 years with that as well this year. Wow. So I started Antic and Floppy Days the same year. That I'm also involved in another one called Next Without 4, right? With my old friend Earl Evans, and we talk about programming languages for either vintage programming languages like COBOL or Fortran, or programming vintage computers. So that's a lot of fun with Earl. Earl's a great guy.
Yeah, that sounds really cool as well. I only learned to program Forth about 10 years ago. I learned it on
Yeah.
a DIY computer that you soldered up yourself. It's called the Fignition, and it's based on FigForth,
Hmm.
and it's a single board computer. And I bought it so I could solder something together, and I constructed it. It had it's 8 button keyboard, so you have to shift to press certain buttons to get the to get the characters up on the screen. But I learned how to program Forth on that, and I made a few games for it and programmed a version of Blitz for it as well. And then with the electronics
Nice.
experience, I actually built a keyboard interface for it. So a PS2 interface went in. A lot of people in the community made an Arduino version, and I just took the chip and then blew the program onto the chip and just had the chip running without the rest of the Arduino. And that was really good. As that got on Hackaday actually. I was quite pleased about that. But yeah, that was yeah. But Forth is such a wonderful language. It is my favorite because if you haven't got a command, you just write one. It's really good like that.
Yeah. I remember during my master's degree in computer science, learning Forth, but I never used it after that. So it is kind of a fascinating language. I remember, wasn't there a computer, the Jupiter Ace? Didn't that come with
Yes.
Forth instead of BASIC? Yeah.
Yeah, that was one that came out of the sort of like, well, it's not the Sinclair family tree, but it was people. It was a spin-off. Some designers went off and designed the Jupiter Ace, and it was a 1K computer. I think it may have had sounds, but it was 1K black and white, rubber keys, what we call like a yogurt pot material for the case. It was really soft. It was a really poor quality case, really, and
Hmm.
but yeah, that ran a Figforth as well, I think, and some of the programs that I uh, converted were from Jupiter Ace programs. But yeah, it just didn't gain any traction really. I think it just came too late. I think most of these did. I think it was Jupiter Cantab were the company that produced it, and it was called the Ace because it was named after the Pilot Ace, which was a computer that was built in the early 50s in Manchester. I think it was done by a post office engineer or something, Tommy Flowers. And it was sort of like it came from like the lineage of Colossus and all that from the Second World War. But yeah, very interesting computer. But completely rubbish at the time. To be fair, it was we were all playing computer games, Randy. So we weren't really interested in that sort of thing.
Right. Right. Especially when you had to program in Forth, right? Like who knows Forth?
Well,
Everybody knows BASIC, but
this is it. You put it in a telly and it was like black and white, and then you typed anything in and just a huge question mark come up because basically, you had to type in VList to get all your commands up. But I only know that, I found that out 10 years ago. So it was all a bit late for me. But that's the other thing with the whole retro computing. I don't think it could have happened without a PC in a way because the PC enabled people to speak to each other on the web. Um, I worked in complete isolation with my Spectrum, and I didn't realize all the wonderful things you could do with it because I wasn't a member of a user group and I wasn't mixing with anybody else that was doing that sort of thing. Um,
hmm.
so I'm getting it all back now because I am sort of finding out these things are online. So, I think, I give the PC a bit of a kick in. I think you do as well, quite rightly. But without it, we just wouldn't be speaking to each other right now, would we?
Well, no, yeah, and I understand that. I mean, a standard was needed. It really was. That's what allowed it to take off. But that doesn't mean, I hope that noise didn't come through.
That's
That doesn't mean that I'm not a little bit mad at the IBM PC for taking away, just the broad um, the broad number of machines that we had that were also different, and that it was just such a rich group of machines that came out in that time frame, and that all stopped when the IBM PC took over.
Mm. Yeah, it certainly did, and it's sort of like individuality when it all had to be sort of like as a big standard, which was a shame. And I never understood the PCs. You had 386s and 086s and whatever else in between, and I didn't understand them. I had no application for them, so I just didn't really adopt one until and like I say, until I was gifted one really. And then like I say, the first thing I did was get a ZX Spectrum emulator on it and play my old games again.
Well,
So
I honestly felt like I went backwards because I went from an Atari ST with the graphical user interface
mhm.
and beautiful, beautiful display and just very powerful machine, 1 meg of RAM in it, and I went to an IBM clone that had less RAM in it. It didn't have a graphical user interface because Windows hadn't taken off yet at that point, and I feel like I went backwards,
Mm.
but didn't have any choice.
No, it's yeah, it was a retrograde step really.
Yeah,
And yeah, because you got
for a
something else.
while.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and but uh, I know that we've always, the moment you buy something from a shop, it's obsolete. But it's sort of like ridiculous now. It's the moment it leaves the factory, it's obsolete now, isn't it? And it's
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it and everything with it being web based, it's sort of like whether the computer can keep up now. It's there's nothing you can do with it. You can't really bolt anything on or anything like that. So yeah, it's very much a shame. There's no room to put a screwdriver in these things anymore.
No, no,
No,
they're not made. They're not. A lot of them aren't made anymore to be user upgraded.
no, no. What are we on at the moment with floppy days then? So you're doing the Newbrain, so you're 82, and then the next big thing would be like you say the Commodore 64.
Right.
And yeah, and you wouldn't have to cover
The Dragon,
oh
the
yes,
Dragon,
yep, the
Dragon
Dragon.
32.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So that was that a Coco? I think was that sort of like a color computer or something like that was rebadged. I'm not too sure. Would that be
Well,
right?
it was built on the same chipset
Mm,
as the Commodore, or I'm sorry, as the Coco
mm-hmm.
was. So it's not really a Coco clone, but it's very, very similar to the
Mm,
Coco machine.
mm, mm.
From what I know,
Yeah.
again, I haven't done all the research yet, so I'll be
No,
learning a lot
no,
before
no.
I talk about it on the show.
So whereabouts do we find your podcast? What's the web address?
Floppydays.com. That's the place to go.
Well, thanks very much for joining me today, Randy. It's been a real pleasure to
Yeah,
speak
great
to
talking
you.
with you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really good.
we've spoke on Discord and other places, many times. It's great to meet you. Thank you.
And thanks again to Randy Kindig for his generous time speaking to me on this podcast. You can find his podcast on floppydays.com, and I urge you to go over there and give it a visit because there's something there for everybody. Also, thank you to Warren Pilkington with the start of this episode with his My First Tech. If anybody listening wants to make a My First Tech segment for this podcast, then please do so. Just hit me up on Twitter or on the Discord and I can get that arranged for you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these podcasts as much as I do making them. And always remember, you can support the podcast by giving it a like in all your favourite places, telling people if you like it, and also if you feel that way inclined, you can also help with the podcast financially by visiting kofi.com/bitehigh, where any proceeds go towards hosting costs and any promotional materials that I do. It is only a hobby podcast and that's the way it will stay, but any little does help. And thank you to everybody out there who has already helped and is contributing at the moment. You know who you are. Byte High No Limit is presented by me, Carlos, and it is a Byte High No Limit production. Until next time, keep it blocky.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.